Maplewood Estates was a neighborhood of precision. Every house, a near-identical clone of the next, sat in neat rows with beige siding and white-trimmed windows. The sidewalks were immaculate, the driveways power-washed weekly, and the lawns, well, the lawns all adhered to an unspoken code. Each yard bore the same pale, muted green, a shade dictated not by nature, but by uniformity. Sprinklers ran at designated hours, landscapers trimmed each blade to regulation height, and fertilizers approved by the Homeowners Association, HOA, ensured nothing grew too wild, too lush. It was a picture of controlled perfection. Except for Jake Turner's lawn. His wasn't just green, it was alive. The grass was thick, a deep emerald carpet that rippled under the breeze like a field of silk. It was the kind of green that made neighbors pause as they passed, the kind that belonged in a gardening magazine rather than a suburban subdivision bound by rules. Jake hadn't set out to be different. Gardening was his passion, a quiet ritual he found solace in before the world stirred awake. He understood soil like an old friend, knowing exactly when it needed more water, less nitrogen, a little aeration. His hands, often speckled with earth, had coaxed his front yard into something thriving, something that felt earned. And now it was a problem. The letter arrived on a Monday, a crisp, white envelope marked HOA violation notice. Jake ripped it open at his kitchen counter, half expecting some trivial complaint. Maybe his trash bins had been left out too long, or the mailbox needed repainting. Instead, his eyes locked on the words that made his brow furrow. Violation. Lawn color noncompliance. Infraction. Excessive pigmentation. Fine $1,000. He read it twice, then again slower. A breath of laughter escaped him, sharp and disbelieving. He had been fined for too much green? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Evelyn Chambers, the HOA president, stood outside, a clipboard clutched in one manicured hand. Mid-60s, dressed in an ironed blazer despite the morning heat, she exuded the kind of authority that thrived on rules. Beside her, a younger HOA board member, Karen Mitchell, stood with arms crossed, her expression one of thinly veiled satisfaction. "Mr. Turner," Mrs. Chambers greeted, her gaze flicking past him to his lawn. "I assume you've received the notice." "I have," Jake said, stepping onto the porch. "And I assume this is a joke?" Mrs. Chambers pursed her lips. "We do not joke about community standards." He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "My grass is too green?" "Yes." She adjusted her glasses. "It disrupts the aesthetic balance of Maplewood Estates." Jake scanned the street, eyes flicking over the monotonous yards stretching in either direction. Aesthetic balance? His lawn didn't disrupt anything. It just wasn't dull. "Look," he said, keeping his voice even, "I don't use artificial chemicals. I water responsibly. I take care of my yard. How is that a violation?" Karen scoffed. "You're making the rest of us look bad." Jake raised an eyebrow. "By having healthy grass?" Mrs. Chambers cleared her throat. "The board has unanimously agreed that your lawn does not conform to the HOA's color guidelines." Jake frowned. "Color guidelines? That's not in the handbook. It's implied. That's not how rules work." Mrs. Chambers sighed, as if speaking to a stubborn child. "Maplewood Estates is a community, Mr. Turner. We maintain harmony through uniformity. Your lawn," she gestured toward the rich green expanse, "is an eyesore." An eyesore. That word sat wrong. Jake had worked tirelessly to turn his yard into something healthy, something that felt like his own. And yet, here he stood, being told that effort was a problem. "So, what do you expect me to do?" he asked, arms crossed. Mrs. Chambers tapped her clipboard. "You have two options. Pay the fine and retreat your lawn to match the rest of the neighborhood. Or, her expression hardened. Failure to comply will result in escalating penalties and, if necessary, legal action. Jake let out a low whistle. You're willing to take me to court over grass? We enforce our regulations without exception. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. A lesser man might have caved, agreed to dull his lawn down just to avoid the hassle. But Jake had never been the type to bow to nonsense. He met Mrs. Chambers' gaze, a slow smile curving his lips. Then I guess I'll see you in court. A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she forced her usual, practiced composure. She gave a tight nod. Very well. As the HOA board members turned and walked away, Jake stood on his porch, watching them go. The morning sunlight cast long shadows over his perfectly green grass, and he realized something. This wasn't about a lawn. This was about control. And he wasn't about to let them win. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, a scent that carried the weight of countless disputes, some significant, some laughable. Jake Turner sat at the defendant's table, shifting slightly in his chair, trying to wrap his head around the absurdity of it all. He was about to go to trial over grass. Across the room, Evelyn Chambers sat with her hands neatly folded on the plaintiff's table, her expression as rigid as ever. Beside her, the HOA's attorney, a wiry man named Douglas Finch, adjusted his tie and flicked through a stack of papers as if he were preparing for a high-profile corporate lawsuit rather than a neighborhood grievance. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Judge Mark Benson was a man in his late 50s, graying at the temples, with an air of experience and exhaustion in equal measure. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and glanced at the case file. His brow furrowed. "Let me make sure I understand this," he said, his voice even but laced with incredulity. "Mr. Turner is being sued because his lawn is too green?" A ripple of muffled laughter passed through the courtroom. Judge Benson held up a hand, silencing it, though a smirk played at the corner of his lips. Mrs. Chambers sat up straighter. "Your Honor, this case is about upholding the standards that make Maplewood Estates a desirable place to live." The judge exhaled, flipping a page. "And that standard requires a specific shade of green?" Douglas Finch cleared his throat. "Your Honor, it's about uniformity. Mr. Turner's excessive lawn pigmentation creates an unfair visual imbalance within the community." The judge blinked. "Excessive pigmentation?" He set the papers down. "Mr. Finch, I need you to say that out loud one more time and listen to how ridiculous it sounds." A chuckle ran through the spectators. Even Jake, who had spent weeks preparing for this nonsense, had to bite back a grin. "Mr. Turner," Judge Benson continued, turning his attention to him, "how do you plead?" Jake leaned forward. "Not guilty, Your Honor, on the grounds that I refuse to apologize for having healthy grass." Another wave of laughter. This time, the judge let it slide. He turned back to the HOA's table. "All right, let's hear your argument." Mrs. Chambers clasped her hands together. "Your Honor, the HOA has spent years maintaining a harmonious aesthetic in Maplewood Estates. That harmony is now disrupted." The judge tilted his head. "By grass?" Douglas Finch pushed his glasses up his nose. "We have photographic evidence demonstrating how Mr. Turner's lawn is distinctly different from the others." He slid a series of glossy photos across the bench. The judge picked one up, examined it, then held it up for the courtroom to see. "So," Benson said, tapping the picture, "what I'm looking at here is a healthy lawn. A good lawn." He placed the photo down. "And you want him fined because it doesn't match the community's, approved shade chart?" Finch hesitated. "Essentially, yes." Judge Benson exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You realize how ridiculous this is, don't you?" Mrs. Chambers bristled. Ridiculous or not, Your Honor, rules exist for a reason. Jake's attorney, Sarah Dawson, finally spoke up. She had been waiting patiently, but now she leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking onto the HOA representatives. Your Honor, she said, there is nothing in the HOA bylaws that dictates an acceptable shade of grass. The regulations state that homeowners must maintain their lawns, and Mr. Turner has done so, arguably better than anyone in the neighborhood. Jake nodded. If anything, I should be getting an award, not a fine. A few chuckles echoed, but Mrs. Chambers was unfazed. The HOA board voted unanimously that Mr. Turner's lawn was an eyesore. Judge Benson tilted his head. An eyesore? Yes. He leaned back in his chair, staring at them for a long moment before shaking his head. You're telling me that out of all the things happening in the world, you people had a meeting about grass and decided that was your biggest concern? Silence. Benson sighed. This case is dismissed. Mr. Turner is not required to pay any fines. A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the courtroom. Jake let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders finally ease. Sarah patted his back, grinning. But Judge Benson wasn't done. He turned to the HOA table, his tone sharper now. Furthermore, I recommend your board reconsider its priorities. Because if this is what you're spending time and money enforcing, I'd hate to see what happens when you face an actual problem. Mrs. Chambers' lips thinned, but she said nothing. Douglas Finch gathered his papers, looking thoroughly embarrassed. Jake stood, shaking hands with Sarah before turning to leave. As he passed Mrs. Chambers, he caught her glare, cold, sharp, but laced with something else. Defeat. And maybe, just maybe, a sliver of doubt. As he stepped outside, the sun cast a warm glow over the courthouse steps. He had won the battle, but he had a feeling the war with the HOA was far from over. The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across Maplewood Estates as Jake Turner pulled into his driveway. His lawn, vibrant, lush, and victorious, glistened under the soft light. The trial was over, the case dismissed, and yet, as he stepped out of his truck, he knew the battle had left something lingering in the air. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, their eyes flickering between Jake and his perfectly green lawn. Some whispered behind cupped hands, others simply watched, unreadable expressions on their faces. He had expected this. The HOA's lawsuit had turned into neighborhood gossip, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. A voice cut through the hush. Hey, Turner. Jake turned to see Greg Morrison, his next-door neighbor, striding over. Greg was the kind of guy who barbecued every weekend and never missed a chance to talk sports. Normally, his conversations revolved around football stats or the best way to grill ribs, but today, his gaze flickered toward the grass. Guess you won, Greg said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jake shrugged. Guess so. Greg let out a low whistle. Never thought I'd see the day someone took on the HOA and walked away without a fine. You just became a legend, man. Jake chuckled, but before he could respond, a new voice cut in. You call that a win? Evelyn Chambers stood at the end of Jake's driveway, arms crossed, her face an unreadable mask. Despite the judge's ruling, she still carried herself like someone who had the final word. Jake exhaled, bracing himself. Mrs. Chambers, to what do I owe the pleasures? She didn't return the pleasantries. Instead, she looked past him, scanning the lawn like a general surveying enemy territory. You may have won in court, Mr. Turner, but don't think for a second that this is over. Greg snorted. Sounds like someone doesn't like losing. Mrs. Chambers ignored him. The HOA exists to protect this community, she continued, her voice smooth but laced with steel. And we will find a way to restore order. Jake met her gaze, unfazed. By what? Suing me again? I followed every rule in your book. You lost. Her lips thinned. For now. With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement. A few neighbors quickly busied themselves, pretending they hadn't been eavesdropping. Greg let out a low chuckle. She really hates that grass. Jake smirked. Good thing I love it, then. He stepped onto his lawn, letting the soft blades press beneath his sneakers. He had fought for this, not just for the grass, but for the principle behind it. The right to take pride in his own work. The right to resist mindless control. And, judging by the hushed excitement in the neighborhood, he wasn't the only one who felt that way. A movement caught his eye. Across the street, Mrs. Patel, a quiet woman in her 70s, stood on her front porch. She gave Jake a small nod before stepping down onto her lawn, watering can in hand. A few houses down, Tom and Lisa Rogers were examining their patchy yard, murmuring to each other. Jake grinned. The HOA had tried to make him an example. Instead, they had made him a symbol. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Maplewood Estates, Jake knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about his lawn anymore. It was about change. And this was just the beginning.